Welcome to episode number 54 of the Road to Cinema podcast, featuring author F.X. Feeney of the new book Orson Welles, Power, Heart, and Soul, which is now available in bookstores and on Amazon.com. The book chronicles and analyzes the life and career of Orson Welles, the Oscar-winning co-screenwriter, director, and star of Citizen Kane. Author F.X. Feeney also shares with us his attempt to write and direct The Big Brass Ring, one of the screenplays that Orson Welles had planned to make before his death. We also analyze many of the points in Orson Welles' career, including the controversial analysis of the screenwriting credit for Citizen Kane, as well as the production of The Other Side of the Wind and what might be happening to the film at this point. And we also discuss author F.X. Feeney's friendship with Oscar-winning director Michael Cimino, who directed the 1978 Best Picture winner The Deer Hunter, as well as the infamous Heaven's Gate. For more information on the Road to Cinema podcast, to read the Road to Cinema blog, and to watch our Road to Cinema YouTube series, please visit jogroadproductions.com. Don't forget, you still have a chance to win a free download of the Final Draft screenwriting software by following us on Twitter at JogRoad, following us on Instagram at JogRoad Productions, liking our Facebook page, JogRoad Productions, and subscribing to our YouTube channel, JogRoad Productions, as well as writing us a nice review on the iTunes podcast page under the Road to Cinema podcast. Once again, do all of the above, and you'll have a chance to win a free download of the Final Draft screenwriting software brought to you by Road to Cinema and our friends at Final Draft. And now we join author F.X. Feeney as he shares with us his initial inspiration for writing his new book, Orson Welles, Power, Heart, and Soul, which is now available to purchase on Amazon.com.
Actually, the book had been in progress for much longer than I realized. It was a kind of unconscious process, or more like an underground stream that had been sort of flowing in at the back of my mind, because I had begun to take a very serious practical interest in Welles during the days when I was working at Z Channel. Z Channel was an amazing pay TV service that was running during the 1980s, and it was a leader in the realm of pay TV because the supervising programmer, Jerry Harvey, saw that there was actually money to be made in using old classics and finding director's cuts and marketing director's cuts. That all comes from Z Channel. And so when I was working with Jerry as a consultant, writing up the magazine and creating on-air promos for the channel, I began to study Welles in earnest. I had always loved him. Welles, since my teenage years, had always been a figure of tremendous exotic appeal, because here's a guy who in his own teens had been directing for the stage, doing all kinds of things. He became a star on radio while still in his late teens, and then in his early 20s a major star on radio with The Martian Prank, and with Citizen Kane at age 25 he's writing, directing, starring, being the chief cook and bottle washer and protagonist of his own life. It's a great exemplary sort of rock star thing to do. Yeah. And I was born in 1953, so when I'm turning 18 in 1971, Welles was being, as it were, seen as a god at that point. It was interesting that he hadn't made films in a while, but he was worshipped by all young filmmakers at that point. And I came out to the California Institute of the Arts to study to become a filmmaker, and so Welles was always at the epicenter of everybody's imagination in terms of what you can do. Yeah. Charlie Chaplin occupied the similar part of the pantheon, and I think Buster Keaton too, for guys, because it was like, okay, these men are doing it themselves, and we would study their careers to see,
and they're all actor, writer, directors.
Exactly.
Their hands in everything.
Exactly. And I think when you're in your late teens and early 20s, of course, you're also trying to sort out your own destiny. And so one looks to people who've sorted out their own destinies, people who've made it work.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's one reason why, for example, Tarantino became so big in the mid '90s, because he was not only a superb storyteller on film, but he was a public presence. He had a persona that was out there on talk shows, and he was in his own films in the periphery.
It's very rare to see a director come out there and be a celebrity in a sense.
Exactly.
And that's what Welles was.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And as I began to look closely at the films, you know, watching them through Z Channel, seeing them again and again, then I began to appreciate, my God, you know, how great it is to see a movie that you can see and re-see. So that certain directors like John Ford, I'd grown up watching John Ford films. I'm actually distantly related to Ford, though I didn't realize that growing up, but his films were on TV all the time through the 1960s. You know, just in the afternoons you could run into them. So when somebody said, "Have you ever seen any John Ford films at Cal Arts?" I thought, I don't know. I mean, what did he make? And then you look at all the list and it's like, okay, Stagecoach, Drums Along the Mohawk. I mean, what haven't I seen? I mean, I'd seen practically all 90 of the films. You know, just because that was the way it was in TV back in the 60s. You know, things were just programmed as filler all the time. So you ended up seeing a lot. And so I had John Ford down as a kind of storybook filmmaker, but then when I'm watching his work on Z Channel, I'm also beginning to see, with the appreciation of a former film student who's done a little bit of acting and tried everything, I'm, oh my God, it's brilliant what he's doing here, what he manages to do in the space of a minute. And watching stuff be repeated on TV there, and working with the tapes to edit commercials. You know, I would be studying, okay, how long does this scene take? Oh wow, he does all that in a minute? That was a real revelation. I hadn't, and also studying Kurosawa and other directors that way. It was a great object lesson at Z Channel, how much a great director can pack into just 10 seconds even. And so with Welles, I was in the position of feeling like I'm reading great prose when I'm looking at how Touch of Evil is put together, or Chimes at Midnight, a movie I really only got to know on Z Channel. So Welles, you know, was there as a kind of now a real center of my heart at this point. And Jerry Harvey died very suddenly and very tragically in the late 80s. That is the whole subject of 4 hour
documentary, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, Zan Cassavetes made a magnificent documentary about Jerry and Z called Z Channel: A Magnificent Obsession, which goes into that. But in the, you know, it's worth noting that about a year before he died, there was The Big Brass Ring was published by the St. Teresa Press. The Big Brass Ring is one of the last screenplays that Orson Welles completed. And basically, he reading that, I've been following the story of that film's efforts to be made in the early 80s, because every day in the Herald Examiner there would be something about it. In Mitchell Fink's column, you know, will Welles get it made, you know, and
even people that he would be attaching to it, and
yes, all the people he was approaching and all that stuff, because Welles had a deal with Arnon Milchan, who later produced JFK and many other things.
Henry Jaglom had helped.
Exactly, Henry Jaglom had introduced him to Milchan, and Henry had made this great. He basically made a great pitch to Welles himself, which was that you need to do something contemporary and political, because if it evokes Citizen Kane, that's your hit single, you know, and Welles took that to heart, because Welles had written a magnificent script called The Dreamers, which was a period piece, and you know, they're not going to let you near that until you do something.
Isaac Dennison kind of.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. Isaac Dennison had done 2 stories, The Dreamers and Da Capo, which he combined brilliantly into one feature, and that's a script that any director, I wish someone would give it to Ridley Scott to try, because you could direct it, you know, like a conductor doing a symphony. Every note is in place. The Big Brass Ring was more of a charcoal sketch, and I remember reading it, you know, and I bought 2 copies at Book Soup when they unpacked the boxes. I bought 2 right away. I thought, okay, I'm taking.
What year was it published?
It was published 1987. So it's a couple of years after Welles' death. I saw that they're actually unpacking it before my eyes. I grabbed 2, drove straight to Z Channel, where I was on my way anyway, because, you know, I would usually, I only get there about midday and then work till midnight. So it was easy for me to, you know, stop at Book Soup in the mornings, and I did. And so I gave one to Jerry, and I said, maybe this is something for us to do. And he, you know, he was talking about it. We chit-chatted, and then Z Channel got busy. You know, we were in the last phase, and a lot of things happened, and he died. So after a couple of years, I was working on a couple of other projects, and, you know, when one fell through, I started looking at Big Brass Ring again, and I read it, one morning again for a second time and thought to myself, well, what can I do? I mean, this other project fell through, but I love this. And Big Brass Ring, as written by Wells, is set in Spain, where I have relatives. And I was actually about to travel to Spain to a wedding. And I thought, well, when I go to Spain, I'm going to look into, these locations and see, maybe you can shoot this on 16 millimeter. Maybe there's in 1991, when I'm having these thoughts, that was the way to do it,
Yeah.
And I thought, and there were a couple of actors that I was friendly with that I thought would be right for it, because Wells was looking for a married couple. He thought of John Cassavetes and Jenna Rollins to play the leads in that film. And I thought, well, Richard Jordan and Blair Brown, they lived together out in Malibu. I got to know them socially and liked them both tremendously, and they were both very approachable. I could, maybe I get the rights to this, I could approach them. So I had a lot of very practical thoughts. Now, a couple of friends of mine said it's very arrogant of you to take on Orson Welles. And I thought, well, yeah, but if you treat
plus to even acquiring the rights to the script.
Yes, that acquiring the rights to the script is one thing, and that became a little saga unto itself. But first, there's the how dare you factor, and I answered the how dare you factor, I thought, with an answer I could still give, which is, it's like, how dare you direct Chekhov? If we treat it as, an unfinished script by or an unmade, a just found script by Chekhov, let's direct it. Let's see what it looks like. It can't hurt. And so that was my attitude. It's like, don't be pretentious. Just figure out how to get it made. And of course, it was, as I say, a charcoal sketch. It clearly, Wells had left a few things in the air about the script, and I think that there was a strategic thought behind that, because he was protecting his position inside the deal. If he could, be the guy to save the scene, well, that's
from reading it, so much of the script is so vague that you think, what's the execution of this? And I think that's what he was trying to hold out for.
Exactly.
Like, this will spark the curiosity of the reader.
Exactly.
And then, I can step in and make it.
Right. In a way, if you compare it to the Dreamers, with the Dreamers, he's working with Isak Dinneson's complete stories, so he could create a symphonic vision of how they would be filmed. Whereas what he's doing in Big Brass Ring is he's kind of inventing an Isak Dinesen story of his own. And when you read the script, it's the voice, the narration between dialogue bits, the scene descriptions are told as if across a candlelit table by somebody speaking, saying, Blake is now thinking of joining the criminal class. And it's like, that's not something you can film, and it's not rendered as voiceover, but it's Wells basically telling you a story, the way Isak Dinesen does on the page. So it was there to be adapted, really. You had to do adaptation. So I think, okay, that's legitimate too. It's like taking a story by Wells and create something new. Well, what happens is, when you get involved with something like the Big Brass Ring, I wrote to Oya Kadar, got a very cordial letter back from her. She said, somebody else just got the rights about a week and a half before I received your letter. She wouldn't say who it was. I later found out from just probing around town that it was a young fellow named George Hickenlooper. So I said, I've got a rival. Okay, so I looked him up at the Academy Library. I thought, he's an interesting sounding guy. And he and I actually met at a party in 1993, and I drew him out about Big Brass Ring, and he was very forthcoming. But I didn't tell him my interest, because I thought it's like saying I'm in love with that girl you're engaged to. So, but I thought, nevertheless, I drew him out about his other work, and we got to know each other slightly in that moment. And not long thereafter, I was able to actually set up a screening for one of George's early films, so that we could view it for Showtime, to see about it. I figured help him out. I mean, if
he
things
had done Heart of Darkness or Hearts of Darkness.
He had done Hearts of Darkness as a documentary, and he had just done his first dramatic feature in 1993, which was alternately called The Killing Box and The Grey Knight. It's a movie that he was embarrassed to have mentioned, once in a while, because he did it on low budget for Roger Corman. But I thought, I liked the film. I thought he managed to make a vampire movie that doesn't use the word vampire, which and set it during the Civil War, which is even wilder. So, and he made it a curse that the African slaves have cast upon the Confederacy.
One of my favorites he did was the original Sling Blade short, which is amazing.
It is.
It's surprising he didn't direct the feature of that, but
I think that what happened was that simply Billy Bob Thornton wanted to take charge of his own destiny. It's that simple.
Yeah.
And there's nothing George could say. George actually did have a deal to do it, but he and Billy Bob just okay, let's just part over this because it's got to be.
Yeah, but you can see a great sense of George as a director.
Absolutely.
In that film with the visuals he uses.
When you compare the two films, it's not that one is superior, but the approaches are so different. It's really interesting. You really see it actually dramatizes what is George's voice and what is Billy Bob's.
Yeah, and you can really see what a director can imbue onto a piece of material.
Exactly.
The same material from two different directors.
Exactly.
Completely different visions.
That's right. That's right. And Billy Bob's performance is viewed very differently. It's seen more as a figure in its own landscape rather than the inside sort of interior monologue that it becomes in its feature form by Billy Bob. So George is a very talented guy, or he certainly was, and at the time I'm going, okay, and I could see that he was getting films made. So I had two thoughts about that. I thought, well, help him out with Showtime. Don't be a rival in that sense, because who knows? One of two things will happen if he succeeds. He'll get so busy that Big Brass Ring will simply drop by the wayside and be mine to snap up, or he'll get going and I'll do my bit and I'll approach him at some point. And if it's meant to be, it's meant to be. So he and I were sort of like friendly rivals in a way. He didn't know it for a long time, but that was my pursuit. I figured, because what he told me at the party is he was going to set it in the United States. He was making it more contemporary. And I thought, Welles wrote such a lovely script set in Spain in the 1984 election. Maybe I thought one way to complete the story to fulfill Welles's original intentions for it, because he, finishing it in 1982, had actually set it 2 years ahead in 1984. As part of that. So I thought,
foreshadowing.
He foresaw really Gary Hart, actually. The Blake Pellerin character is so close to, he was one of the people he approached was Warren Beatty to play the part, and you can look at Blake as he's conceived on paper and you go, yeah, this is Gary Hart in 84. So
it's fascinating because Gary Hart, I think, was also caught on a boat with a woman, and that was photographed. So it's that boat was sort of at a center of the Big Brass Ring as well. So,
right. Yeah, exactly right. There's that photograph of the girl on his you're right. Yeah.
that just came to me now.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And you see, the other thing that Welles was dealing with, which I go into this in my book, it's because I found when I got to Spain and I'm looking around at all the locations, every location in the script was there. So I had a beautiful feeling, like I was a Welles tourist. I'm doing the Welles tour of Spain because I'm finding these obscure cafes that he mentions, and they're all there. I don't know that they're there anymore, but boy, they sure were for the moment, and they were so atmospheric. I thought, get a camera and you just sit down with your friends and make this movie, Yeah. So I was very thrilled, but I also learned that in the year after I came back from Spain, it emerged that Iran-Contra, the whole business of trading arms to the Iranians to get money on the side, and all these sort of deals were set up in Madrid at the Ritz Hotel, which is where all the espionage stuff goes on in Welles's own Big Brass Ring.
Yeah.
So Welles, who was in touch with the Iranian government to try and free Other Side of the Wind, knew very well, and it's even a line in the screenplay of Big Brass Ring, that Madrid is a great hub. It's a place for developing assets for the CIA, and it was, of course, if you wanted to fly to Tehran, you would fly to Madrid because that was the hub that would get you from Madrid to Tehran. So anyway, Welles had all of that sort of like under the surface of the iceberg in his own script, and it was exploding in the early 90s. So I thought, make this a period piece set in 84, but this time just do it in a clairvoyant way. So I felt that way you could keep what Welles wrote like a fly in amber, but you create the amber around it so that we have the magnifier of what we now know. That was kind of my approach. But that ran out of gas after a couple of years because I would show the script around a bit to people and I'd get nice responses, but I didn't have the rights. There was a moment when I almost had the rights, but still George was persisting. So there was a moment when I thought, okay, it's time to call George and show him what I've written, because I had a very tight, interesting script. And I figured if he likes this and we spark to each other, maybe this is meant to be. So we did. Yeah. And that's what happened. And when I saw what he had written, set in the United States and contemporary, I was very energized. I was afraid I'd be offended, but you can't get offended on Welles' behalf after all this, because I had already done a full-on treatment of his version. And I realized, it's a non-starter commercially because it's a period piece set in Spain 15 years ago, and it's harder to sell that. And I thought, okay, but there's also the other aspect, which is that George is a young man and he's written a young man's script. And I would think, Wells would applaud a young guy seizing the opportunity and going for it. So I thought, well, there's a combination we can do. And that's what we ended up doing. In honoring Wells's intentions, it became a very improvised kind of dance atop logs that are rolling down river. You've got elements that Welles put into place. And then there are philosophies that Welles had, which is Welles always promoted the idea that a filmmaker should work innocently, the way Adam and Eve named the animals. So, there's a kind of innocent energy that Welles would have applauded in what George and I were doing, which is, okay, inspired amateurs, we're in love with this story, but how do we do it? How do we make it come to life? And really, the answer is through the characters. And when you're studying the characters, and I think if you study Wells's script and you study the film that resulted that we made with William Hurt and Nigel Hawthorne and Iran Jacob, well, what you see in common are the characters. That we were able to be true to. Yeah. And I think that the other aspect was, in order to bring George's American adaptation closer to Welles without sending everybody to Spain, there was a missing ingredient. And it came from my deep reading of Welles in the act of adapting Big Brass, which was that Welles had a brother who was 10 years his senior, who looked almost exactly like him, but was afflicted with schizophrenia. So he was a disappointment to the parents. He was always in trouble. He ended up being institutionalized for a number of years. And then he would sort of show up in Wells's life, just kind of like a Flying Dutchman.
It was bizarre reading that in the book, how, he showed up, he was in Beverly Hills at one point, he was on the set of certain movies.
Yes.
He just sort of...
He had been a drifter himself for a long time. So what happened, in one instance, there were some bums. Now, there are two variants to the story. One is that it happened in the 30s when he's in New York directing a street scene, and the other is that when he's in San Francisco directing a street scene with Rita Hayworth, for Lady from Shanghai, where he's asking these derelicts to take positions, and in the crowd parts, and he turns to either Rita Hayworth or his first wife Virginia and says, "Oh, this is my brother Richard," and takes him to lunch. And he did support him. He sent him a check every month for life. I mean, he made sure that he was looked after. But Richard Welles would sometimes turn up at Orson Welles fan clubs and introduce himself as Orson Welles to people. And so he was a problematic kind of brother, But, and Peter Bogdanovich in the conversations with Welles tries to bring him up, and Welles says, no, we're not going to discuss him. Let's not even talk about that. And so it's like a sealed door. So I thought, okay, there's a live wire. There's a third rail for Welles that he just wouldn't touch, except that it's done symbolically in his work, because in every Orson Welles film, you have a very fraternal contest that is often life and death between males. I mean, it's, there's Kane and Jed Leland in Citizen Kane. There is, in Chimes at Midnight, it's Falstaff and Prince Hal. Those are the bookends of Wells's major film career. I mean, Othello, Iago, Touch of Evil.
Brooks Overlake and Jack Hannaford in Other Side of the Wind.
Exactly. It is never absent from his work, and yet it's never unmasked. So I thought, well, here's a way to, as it were, be free with Welles and yet be true to Welles at the same time. Give the character of Blake Pellerin, who had a long absent mistress in the screenplay, but change that mistress, make her a long lost brother. What happens then? Then I felt, and I believe it comes true, that it energizes the contemporary adaptation in a very Wellesian way. Now, all of this forms the backdrop to how I wrote this book, because basically, as I was forming all these ideas and fighting these particular battles, I was becoming very educated about Welles in a very particular way that no book I'd read had quite satisfied. And the hub of my recognition about this is how politically conscious Welles was, how politically active he was. Now, Joseph McBride and James Naramore have both written, with attention and real respect, and also Jonathan Rosenbaum have all written with attention and respect to Wells's political life. But they touch on it. It's not necessarily the key. It's just simply an interest of his that they take seriously and honor. But I felt, no, this is absolutely serious, because you read all the biographies. I mean, he formed such a close friendship with FDR that it's clear that Welles was not just getting to know the famous and powerful. He was actually developing the idea of a political career for himself. And what if you look at his life, examining it as a political career that was planned for and then went derailed, instead of a film career? There's always the whatever happened to Orson Welles. Well, he came to Hollywood and he blew it. And it's like, no, he didn't. Hollywood was not his main event. He was a New Yorker, successful in radio, who, swooped through Hollywood and he grabbed all the goodies he could because he had a winning hand. With the Martian prank, he was given a fantastic 3-picture deal with RKO. Great. But he was also headed back to Washington. That's why he took the assignment that, in retrospect became such a disaster, where he went to South America to make a documentary about the
which
carnivals.
Unfortunately put Magnificent Ambersons into peril.
Yes.
So.
Yes, he divided his energies, much like Custer dividing his troops at Little Bighorn and Wham. He got, he basically, it was a fatal series of steps. And you can't say that any of them were self-destructive. People have sometimes characterized Welles as self-destructive. And certainly he can appear that way from certain angles. But my sense is, no, he's Apollo. I mean, he's more Prometheus. He's Prometheus stealing fire from the gods. He doesn't think he's going to screw up. He's actually trying to reach for the fire. He's reaching for it. Now, that's hubris. There's a whole set of tragic energies that can attach themselves to a guy who does that. But Welles was young enough and free enough and, on top of his game enough to think, no, that won't apply to me. And so there he goes.
Well, major theme that comes up in your book is the trust that Orson Welles sort of lost in certain people, the confidence that he had in certain people.
Yes.
And that seems to sort of carry on in his life and just keep getting worse.
Yeah.
Whether it be John Houseman or even the people who took care of him as a child.
Yeah. I think trust was probably the great issue of his life. Betrayal is, of course, the great theme of his dramas. I mean, there's always a treachery going on, and sometimes people are acting against their own interests, but really that whole sense of treachery is there, and I think it was there from the beginning. But what happens is that there were certain people that he could rely on completely. There's of course his teacher Skipper Hill at the Todd School. There's also a man named Richard Wilson who was, just so reliable and kept the archives, and a lot of the defense of Welles that scholars have been able to mount in recent years against, the different attackers. As various as Pauline Kael and Charles Hyam, the first biographies, or even David Thompson, who writes a very empathetic book on one hand, but he's projecting a lot of his own stuff on Welles. He's writing in a sense a nonfiction novel in Rosebud. So these interpretations of Welles are answered by the archive that Richard Wilson kept, which shows there's a series of sort of frog in a pot clicks where the heat turns up, but Welles is not turning the heat up. It's just circumstance changes. But in any event, Welles found, there are people that he trusted in a fraternal way, such as Houseman. So what one wishes, is that, oh God, if only, they could have stayed together for several films. Yeah. Because if Houseman had been still on board to protect Ambersons, it would have been protected. It would have been.
It's just bizarre how there was such a rift there that Houseman kept perpetuating that Welles hadn't written the screenplay for Citizen Kane for many years.
I know.
I don't know where that hatred and...
I think it was hard for Houseman to look at the spectacle of Welles in difficulty. And so by the late 60s, he's just being more dismissive, that it's Orson's fault that he's in this way, and I think so that lit up his remarks to Pauline Kael over lunch. Although, see, Pauline Kael didn't take any notes of her lunches with Hausman. So, you get, okay, how much of this is really from Hausman and how much of this is her reweaving? Because when her biographer went and looked, he could find no evidence that she'd taken any notes of her conversations with anybody.
This is from the essay, I believe it was Raising Cain.
Yes.
Which
Let me
perpetuated that Orson Welles hadn't written Citizen Kane. It was old Herman Mankiewicz.
Right. Now, I had actually, by the way, in my early talk about the iconic Welles that teenagers worshipped, he wrote, directed, starred in. Let me be clear. Herman Mankiewicz, wrote the first draft that became Citizen Kane. And he actually wrote 2 drafts from what I understand, but that was, the second was under Wells's heavy direction, and then Welles took it from there. And the Writers Guild, which definitely looked at all these things, saw that, okay, Welles would have, passed muster. Yeah. You need to have, a director needs to be responsible for at least 50% of the script. And it was clear that by the end, Welles was responsible for about 70%, in rewriting Mankiewicz. Mankiewicz had done a very, very thorough and lively job of creating, as I put it in my book, a 200-page novel in screenplay form called American, which basically rehashed a lot of the details of Hearst's life. And Welles, very prudently, and with Hausman, at his side, thought, no, let's base it on a couple of other guys. So you had, Robert Insull and a guy named McCormick, all these sort of big dinosaur robber barons of the newspaper world. And they wove all their stories in. And it was also when Hausman was collaborating with Mankiewicz out in the desert on the first draft, he also said, steer clear, if we can, of Hearst by basing it on Mr. Welles. They were calling him the dog-faced Wonder Boy, so they were both, they both sort of had enough of him in a way, and they were sending him up in that script. And Welles was taking that, he was seeing that they were using aspects of his life story, and he went with it full throttle. So the authorship of the screenplay is properly attributed to Mankiewicz first, Welles second. Yeah. But it was a project that Welles cooked up, that he invited Mankiewicz to undertake.
He was a writer for hire.
Yeah, exactly. And it's what Pauline Kael could not see in her essay that she published, Raising Cain, in 1971, was how intricate and how much of a tennis match collaboration in any movie is. And it's a tennis match between as many as 10 players. There's got to be one winner, one senior partner, one person who calls the shots at the end of the day, and that was Welles. Yeah. And so that's to try and undermine him by suggesting that someone else wrote it in its entirety is just wrong. And so what we have, I don't know, the question about trust. There's Hausman basically, putting poison darts out about Welles in the late 60s. And unfortunately, it was at a sensitive moment for Welles, because at that moment in Hollywood, one could get, Easy Rider was made for $300,000 and, made $60 million at the box office. That's bigger than Star Wars was. I mean, Star Wars may be bigger now in dollar terms, but
in profit margin.
Sure. You're thinking of something that's made 180 times its original budget. And you look back and you think, oh, if only there was a way to mix Welles in there. Now, Other Side of the Wind was clearly an effort to do that. Yeah. And, one can only mourn that so much went wrong inside that. And I think that there must be, the issue of trust. And who do you trust? Welles was enough of a wounded animal that there were very few people he could trust, and he ended up trusting the wrong people, that guy, that Iranian middleman or Spanish.
And sometimes the people that he should have been trusting, he turned on them, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I know. And really, in a way, you see, the turning on the people you trust, sometimes you act out emotionally on the people who are there for you. You know, in any family squabble, it's who do you take it out on? The one who's really listening. so it's like, you know, you can see, you know, all kinds of human error in Wells's conduct of his own career. That doesn't displace him as a genius or an artist, because he's the great noble thing about Welles is that to his dying day he was working on his next project and giving it his all. You know, whatever deficits there were in his skill set, and I think that really, you know, there are limits even to great talent. His great talent was for envisioning a story and telling it well. Managing the practical affairs of satisfying the moguls, of keeping the fires burning at the, you know, at the base camp, so to speak. Yeah. Talents at which, for example, Houseman excelled, and also Richard Wilson and other people that Welles got to, had attracted into his orbit. When he had a protector, when he had somebody at his flanks who could handle things, nobody could touch Welles. But there was that one skill set that he just could not master. And I think, you know, that may be the byproduct of his childhood too, where in a sense everything is so done for him, everything is so provided for him, that he didn't learn, there were certain skill sets he couldn't develop about providing for himself. And so there's an anger that comes with that, and a, you know, just a rage, and it'll come out at the, you know, when you're skinned, you know.
Yeah, it seems like he almost preferred chaos in a way, just reading about the production of The Other Side of the Wind. I mean, it was just so, I mean, he would shoot parts of scenes and move around all the...
I would say that, not that he preferred chaos, I think he trusted chaos as a creative resource. He liked to say that a director presides over accidents. And I think how much he demonstrates that in Other Side of the Wind. Yeah. He's trying to create the atmosphere of accident. Oh, go, do, yeah, and just, you know, and also because of what he discovered at the editing table early on, which is that, you know, people are reacting to the next thing they see, and you can cut from one thing to the next, and people, you know, if it's a smooth flow, it creates serenity, and if it's conflicting, it creates a different feeling, which is still useful, that it's all useful. And the idea that it's all useful is a really beautiful, positive energy that he has, that I think inspires a lot of filmmakers. I think it was an inspiration to Kubrick, because Kubrick, on several levels, I think Kubrick was directly inspired by Welles. One is this trusting the accident, because something that Kubrick told James B. Harris is that, you know, when Harris was about to direct, he said, don't let the studio tell you that you have to match all the over-the-shoulder shots.
Yeah.
You know, you can go close up, you can cut from one to the next, it doesn't matter. You just, whatever looks good and is interesting. And I believe that has to be a discovery that Kubrick, he doesn't attribute it, but I think Kubrick made that discovery watching the films of Orson Welles, because Welles was the first to kind of break that.
He wasn't very traditional at shooting coverage in the normal ways that we're used to.
Exactly.
And a lot of the things like crossing the line, or, you know, shooting over shoulders. And
exactly.
He, you know, it seems like he was cutting a lot in the camera in a sense where he was sort of, he knew how he wanted the scenes to cut, and that's how he was directing the movie on a daily basis.
He pre-visualized in such a way. He had an idea in his head. Oh, this will go with that very well, and I can get that later. And how to move in on it. And when you see him, it's a really interesting documentary, one-man band, that is on the Criterion disc of F for Fake. You get to see him directing Oya Kodar in the extant footage of The Dreamers. And what's interesting is that he doesn't say cut. He just keeps the camera rolling. And she just has to reset, you know. He doesn't even command that. She just knows, and she's doing the same line. She says, oh, louder, no, you're angry now. No, you need, and she just attacks the same line of dialogue several different ways, and it's wonderful because you see, you know, she's a good actress. She's nailing a different feeling each time, but her energy is up. You know, when you say cut, well, okay, everybody's checking their messages, they all dissipate.
You're turning off equipment, everybody's
taking, you know, even for a few seconds, man, everybody's, you know, and it's like, how do you get the energy up? Welles knew, just roll through. So with that in mind, you know, he knew that he could as much discover the film on the editing table, because there's the movie you think you're going to shoot, there's the movie that unfolds before your eyes, and then there's the movie you can salvage from all the madness that you caught on the set. And when you have a full support system, as for example he had on Touch of Evil, well, then the magic is happening 24/7. I think part of the power of that movie is that he had universal support. It was simply that they'd kind of done him the favor of letting him alone.
Yeah.
I think he did himself the favor of shooting a miraculous 12-page scene on the first day so that they could strike the set 2 days ahead of schedule. Yeah. He pulled that off. That's the interrogation scene that comes in the middle of the film. And you don't realize that it's all one shot because he deliberately cuts into it with interstitial scenes set at a telephone outside and so forth. He's not doing a long 12-minute shot to show off. He's simply doing it to accomplish as much as he can and to keep the energy intense between the actors. And wouldn't you know, he also managed to be 3 days ahead of schedule by the end of the day.
Yeah, that's what he seemed to also be doing with The Other Side of the Wind. I mean, even there's a scene you describe in the book about Henry Jaglom and Paul Mazursky were pitted against each other, and he knew that they had this personal problem.
Yeah.
And he just put them in front of the camera, and they played out something that was fictitious, yet there was a reality.
All for different energies. Yes. Yeah. Yes. You get it. You see that, and you see, because there's Mazursky is, without meaning to, defending the studio line, and Henry Jaglom's talking the Wildcatter line. They both went their separate ways, in this, but both are independent-minded. But and then you got Dennis Hopper, with his cowboy hat, talking about the magician.
Some of that material was on YouTube a few years ago.
Yes,
and
I think
no one knows who put it up there. That's interesting.
I wonder. That's an interesting question. I suspect Gary Graver put it up. Because
when did he pass away?
He passed away, I believe it was in 2007. I need to double check that, but it was because he came to speak to my class in 2006, and he died. The last time I saw him was at the end of 2006.
Yeah, you talked about that in your book.
Yeah,
he came to your class at USC.
Yeah, and he died so suddenly. It was in early 2007, if I'm not mistaken. So it would. I don't know when that was mounted on YouTube. YouTube was new in 2006, but it was up. And it would have been very much like Gary to put footage out there because he did have access to it. And
he had a rough cut. He didn't have the actual
right. He didn't have the negatives.
But he had a rough cut that Orson had put together at one point. Is that correct?
It's correct. He had Orson had cut together about 45 minutes of fine cut. There's 45 minutes of extant fine cut, roughly, maybe 47. Joe McBride knows the exact number, but it's approximately 45 minutes of fine cut footage. I mean, fine cut, you know exactly what Welles meant for each scene. Then there's like 10 hours of footage all in, and there's a lot of very rough cut footage that I saw in 1998. About an hour and a half of it to tack on to the 45 minutes.
And this is Gary had invited you to see it.
Yeah, Gary invited me to see it, and he invited a Sony executive. This was while, the Touch of Evil was the per capita largest hit in American theaters that weekend, or 2 weekends in a row. It had made more money than any other film, and per theater it was selling out.
Yeah.
And so the moment was perfect to sell a new film by Orson Welles. But unfortunately, there was so much footage that Gary showed the guy. I'll never forget the guy. He was like, with this smile, just like, oh, it's so original, so fascinating. We'll talk. And he disappeared, never to hear from him again.
You would think he would have just showed him sort of like the fine cut footage and then just kind of left it at that, but he wanted to really
he thought that the guy would be as excited by it. And so Oya, who she had a meeting set, she was in town too. I met her the same couple of days, and she said, "Oh, Gary, Orson said never be afraid of scissors," and so she cut it back to basically the 45 minutes of fine cut that she interspersed very cleverly with, very choice outtakes of the rough stuff. Yeah. So it became, I think, an hour-long presentation roughly by then.
Yeah. But the actual, footage, the original print was still in France, so.
Yes, the original negative.
So this was sort of a copy. What was used in the rough cut was sort of like a copy of that footage in a way?
Well, it was, yeah, or, it was, I guess it was the interpositive that had been made from the negative. And at Welles, it's simply fine cut at his leisure. But, his negative is sitting in a French vault.
Pristine negative.
Pristine negative. And Gary, at that point, Gary had introduced the footage very well. And, and everybody was enthusiastic. I think even the Sony executive had enthusiasm, but he had no butterfingered grasp on what he could sell to his own executives. How do we make this? So I think the next day showed it to probably Showtime, because they went for it. Now they also had a wonderful executive there named Matthew Duda, who I got to know years before we did Big Brass, and he was one of the people who bought Big Brass. In fact, Big Brass Ring had its debut on Showtime, because Matthew Duda, and he was a big supporter of Other Side of the Wind, and Oya showed him and a select group of others that footage, her tight footage, and of course that closed the sale.
Yeah.
But then it became always a battle with that damn Other Side of the Wind, and it's tragic because it's such, in its pristine form. I mean, if you find a form for it, and I think it's there, it would just be wonderful to have.
Yeah.
An editor friend of mine said, it won't be the same. It won't be a new Orson Welles film. I thought, well, The Last Tycoon technically is not a new novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald, but his friend Edmund Wilson did a magnificent job of sorting through the manuscripts and creating
and Peter Bogdanovich says that he has the notes that could help put it together.
He has the notes, and he has the notes, and he has the movie sense, and I think Joe McBride also has good. I know that there's a whole. Oya Kodar has become a lightning rod of controversy on this, and I don't know. I know her only well enough to be positive about her. So I've only had good experiences with her. But my sense, if I look at why she's cautious, is because she made a very bad deal about Don Quixote in the early '90s, and I think she's always regretted that. And so,
but you would think at this point, because you have Felipian Rimshaw, who's organized this crowdfunding campaign and raised all this money from people who are just giving donations, that she would be more accommodating and think, hey, they have the best of interests. And,
right. It may be that she wanted. Money. That's the money is real. After a point, and you've been shepherding this all along, so your sense of your value escalates. What are you going to do? I'm hopeful that they'll just simply navigate these rocks, because they're fundamentally navigable. It's not. It should. Right now, the ducks are in a row. Everybody wants to see this movie.
Yeah, and everybody's cooperating for the most part.
I think.
From her, so.
Yeah, and I think this is where Karp's book is particularly vital, because it is made it a holy grail that's actually reachable.
Yeah.
And let's grab it. Let's have a look at this thing. It's Wells's fine material is so good that it completes the argument for what his intentions were. And all anybody has to do after that, I think, and Peter Bogdanovich knows this Howard Hawks rule better than anybody. A good movie is 6 good scenes and no bad ones. So how do you and so we've already got the 6 good scenes. How do we make it so that there are no bad ones?
Yeah.
Just find the good scenes in the rest of the footage and let them form the arc. I mean, there may be an aesthetic that you can honor in Welles, where you're going for the most alive stuff, and nobody can tell where the forgery exists. Because really, the thing about Welles' raw footage that struck me was that, he's like a watercolor artist who's so full of energy that every damn brushstroke is interesting. Even if it squiggles off into nothing, it's kind of like, whoa, you're riding electrical current. Yeah. And so, you need to edit that current so that it has impact. But nonetheless, it really, looking at the raw footage, really exposed an aspect of Wells's native gift that I've never been able to forget, which is just.
From reading about it seems like he was trying to do something very innovative with the cutting of the film, and to give it a different perspective. And
yes, he was
satirizing sort of these artsy films like Antonioni at the time, and playing into that. So
yes, he was satirizing them, but I think and Joe McBride is very adamant that he was satirizing these films, whereas Oya was wanting to maintain the poetry of them. And I think actually the tension between them is, between those two viewpoints, not necessarily between Oya and Joseph, but the idea that, okay, is this satire or is this really poetry? I think there's an ambiguity you can honor there. There's a wonderful novel by Vladimir Nabokov called Pale Fire, where you have a poem, a very beautiful poem in the manner of Robert Frost, which is being commented on by a madman scholar. So, okay, is this poem a spoof, or is it a real poem? I always respond to the poem as a real poem, but it's a minor portion of the main body of the novel. So, I think in a way, I would use that as my example if I'm cutting that picture. I figure, okay, let the poetry be poetry, let the satire come in because it's got bite. You can. There's a tightrope you can walk where it serves both purposes. Because I think, to a certain degree, Welles was so in love with making movies that even though he deplored the length Antonioni would hold a shot and things like that, he nevertheless, I think his own love of movie making would have informed the way he cut those scenes so that they would be playful, above all playful, rather than simply satirical. So my hope for the cut that they prepare out of this is that those sequences have all the poetry and play that they need to just sort of, so that you can see the potential there and also see the lunacy.
It seems like once they settle this with Oya and to prepare editing, that eventually the next fight will be, well, which cut do we use? They'll probably come up with all these different versions of the film. And
there's the beauty of DVD.
There, so,
Well, I think that what happens is that when people have signed off, there will be an extant release cut. And then what you can do, with all that 10 hours of footage, my God, the DVD extras will be worth owning the disc unto itself. Make a deal with Criterion, and it's just, and I think that in this age of, the various capacities, I had the thought that why not release it as a kit, that you could, for a good amount of money, like what you'd pay for a Taschen book, one of those fat ones, the Kubrick archive for $140. Your Christmas gift to the filmmaker in your life is the other side of the wind, the footage. And the idea is that you can make a film out of this, You can't make money off it. And then you have people do their versions, and just invite people to, and so what happens is you got, just let the world participate, and there's an extant cut that shows, that's like a skeleton key, and just invite people in, because Welles was such an inspiring force that maybe that's the ultimate destiny of Other Side of the Wind, that all that magnificent footage will become, fodder. And I think the same thing you can do with the footage from It's All True. Put it there so that other filmmakers can play with it and work with it.
It was interesting at the Chapman University conference that they participated in recently. Joseph McBride mentioned that he may have found a lead on the Magnificent Ambersons footage. I don't know if he's talked to you at all about that, but
he's talked to me a little about it, and I know he's following on a suggestion by another scholar, Bill Crone, who had unearthed the idea that, an intact print of Magnificent Ambersons was sent to South America while Welles was down there.
Was that the version that was previewed in Pasadena?
It had all the footage in it, and it had everything. So he had that copy down there, and it was in the lab down there. And then RKO ordered the lab to destroy it, and a telegram came back, Ambersons destroyed, But the thing is, that guy who ran that lab, he was known to just never destroy anything. He was always keeping stuff. So there are accounts from film students in Brazil of having seen the version of Ambersons in the early 60s. So it's like, well, where is it, And so that's, I think, it was, seeing, we had all that footage from Ambersons. We were using it as sound fill. It's like, oh my God, you were using it as sound. It's like, so the footage may exist somewhere, Also, bear in mind that very recently, an intact, it was a bad copy, but an intact version of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, full, all the footage emerged in Buenos Aires. Someone had made a 16 millimeter dupe of what had been, the original 35 millimeter nitrate footage of the intact version, They just, as a protection, they did it, and it's like a poor copy, but boy, it allows you to see everything that Fritz Lang meant. So it could be that there's a way to track down where this footage is. So that's Joe's next big archaeological dig.
Yeah.
And he's such a thorough guy. That aspect of scholarship is why I particularly trust McBride. I find him to be, relentless in his pursuit of whatever the truth is under the truth. He believes that there is a truth to be known. You just have to be steady with it. And so I believe that he's a valuable voice for Welles in particular, because he cuts through so much of the BS that has gathered up around Welles.
Yeah, and he was also an actor in The Other Side of the Wind.
That's exactly so. Exactly so. He has a front row seat at the 50-yard line for all that stuff. So it's I think the beauty of Welles's life is that he attracted so many people that are still dedicated to him years after his death. Because I think, as with any great talent, I think this happened with Stanley Kubrick. I think you can observe it in the life of Pablo Picasso. All the people that are just attracted to the sense of a talent being fulfilled. Because there's nothing more beautiful, because it fulfills everybody's talent. Picasso's paintings aren't just great because he painted them. They're great because they make us see better than we saw before we looked at them. You come away looking at the world in a different way, and you're thrilled to have your whole viewpoint be broken up and be dazzled. And so, to get to know the big minotaur making this stuff is, people are naturally attracted to such a person, and they're very loyal because they know that person is, however much of a bastard Picasso could be to everybody in his personal life, there was something fundamentally unselfish about him when he's in relation to a canvas. And it's that kind of mad, divine unselfishness which is what attracts people. Now, I think in Welles's case, he had that unselfishness also translated into a kind of personal warmth and generosity, which you can see in any number of stills of him working with actors on a set. He knew how to make actors comfortable. He just had a gift of getting everybody to laugh. I mean, there's a lot of still photos of, say, Anthony Perkins just splitting his sides laughing on the set of Kafka's of The Trial, And although Kafka was known to sort of crack up while he was, with giggles when he's reading his own stuff because he found it funny. Generally we don't find Kafka funny, but I think Welles was able to get to something under it so that one could feel the playfulness.
Yeah. Someone who came up a lot in your book is Michael Cimino, who actually helped you write. He gave you some notes in the big brass ring
he did.
When you were writing it.
Oh.
So I'm curious how you developed a friendship with him, and because there's so much speculation about Cimino as a person and what has happened to him over the years.
Oh yeah, Cimino is a really remarkable man. I met him through Jerry Harvey at the Z Channel. I had written about Year of the Dragon, and it was a positive review, one of the few that the movie got when it came out, which is amazing to think.
Now I think people are looking back on it more favorably.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what happens. A movie comes out, it gets condemned, and then there's like a wave of Hong Kong movies, and John Woo and all these films come along, and then you look at Year of the Dragon, and you realize, oh, this was like a forerunner to all of that craze, and it's also really great in and of itself. Well, in any event, I tapped into it, and Cimino had responded, and so he wanted to meet me through Jerry, and we met, and it was really great. We were cautious with each other for the first couple of years because, I think Cimino was the one that made the comparisons. It's like Woody Strode and Kirk Douglas and Spartacus. You might have to meet me in the ring and kill me at some point. So, we sort of had a mutual respect, and Jerry would sometimes bring us together. We'd be seated at a common table, but I didn't really get to know Michael until after Jerry's death. And then we were both missing a very dear friend to both of us, and we ended up becoming great friends ourselves. And I was no longer writing movie reviews. From about 1988 on until 92, I was working as a screenwriter, and so I didn't. I took up reviewing again in the mid 90s, but in that 4-year period, I was meeting with Cimino almost every day. He was working on a number of projects. He always, Cimino, like Welles, is somebody who always has something going on. Yeah. He has, I would visit him. He has a wonderful house, on the top of Mulholland, and he tends to work in his kitchen, which he has a really nicely appointed kitchen, and there's like these great sort of brewer chairs, and he's got stacks of scripts. I mean,
these are all that he wrote.
That he's working on. And
even to this day, he's still.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen him in the last few months or so, but I know that he's constantly at work on stuff. And certainly in the '90s, he was just, he had finished scripts that he'd have typed up. He had a typist, so he'd write everything in longhand. So you'd have all these, different, yellow manila pads that legal pads, basically, that would be in folders, just stacked up to go out on various projects. Because if he wasn't writing a new one, he'd be looking at an old one. How can I make this better? How can I make a deal out of this? Wow. So, he's a guy who's just a demon of work at all times. And I think that's particularly, he's somebody who, he would get very wary sometimes when I'd be talking about Welles, because he didn't want to visit the specter of Wells's, being, in that kind of twilight career, not twilight in the sense of it's over, but just somehow not being able to get work in Hollywood, because Michael certainly has lived that one. I think lightning hit him with Heaven's Gate. And
this was right before he won all the Academy Awards for The Deer Hunter, and
I know he'd
lauded around town.
I know he'd gone from Best Picture and Best Director to being suddenly, the scapegoat. For really, if you look at Heaven's Gate and what happened to it, it was a movie that got scapegoated for the quote unquote excesses of the 1970s. You look at Apocalypse Now, you look at Fitzcarraldo. There's a lot of juggernaut pictures, a lot of pictures where they jump the tracks of their original budget and they expand. Part of this is because silver and silver nitrate went up in value in the late 70s, so suddenly film stock triples.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's a one of those odd things that doesn't get remarked on, but that was expanding budgets, right? And you also have a factor which nobody's really written about, to my knowledge, but I've noticed it because defending Heaven's Gate, I noticed, okay, Dr. Dolittle at 20th Century Fox, you got Waterworld and Universal right before Universal sells to the Japanese. Mm-hmm. You got Heaven's Gate at UA, which sold out. It didn't destroy UA. UA simply sold a kind of a profit to its stockholders, to other companies, became part of MGM. So, all right, you say, is it possible that certain juggernauts prefigure the sale of a studio? Not in a conspiratorial sense, but maybe it's a kind of Tembler under the tsunami sense of, nobody's minding the store because we're basically concentrating on other things while we're getting ready for the sale. Or, it's allowed to become a juggernaut because, someone can quote unquote come to our rescue, and that, it's like, I don't know the economics of these things well enough to be able to speak about them knowledgeably.
Final Cut. I don't know if Stephen Bach was an executive there at the time. But,
right.
Yeah, it seemed very accusatory at Michael in terms of.
Yeah, he was very frustrated with Michael personally, and so there's a personality conflict between him and Cimino, which I can see is very real, and I see Michael in his portrait of Michael. Michael he's a I want to use the word secretive in a strategic sense. He plays his cards very close to the vest, and he's a master at pushing you back so you don't get too close, because he needs to protect his options.
Yeah.
This is a thing with certain big guys. I know that there was David Lean, for example. I remember a story about him that why he got rid of Nicholas Roeg on Lawrence of Arabia. Roeg was too quick with the setups. I think this is in the David Lean biography by Kevin Brownlow.
That's something I didn't even realize. Nicholas Roeg was going to be the DP of Lawrence
he's
of
one.
Arabia.
He's one of the credited DPs. He's one of the camera operators, but he had a problem, and it was something that Lean even said, I can't hate you for this, Nick, but you're too quick. He would have too many setups, and Lean would want time to think. He would need to be sure, and if the setup's already, it's like, I have to shoot it now, and it's like, there was a funny kind of conflict that way. So what happens is that a great director is often in the position of protecting his options. That's why I feel like Welles was doing the Big Brass Ring script as a charcoal sketch, because he was protecting his options for the set.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting strategy, that. So I think, when I read, I did read Final Cut, and I read it early on, and I could see, it's there. It's a kind of like a biography of Orson Welles by John Houseman. There's a disappointed love there on the part of Bach. I think, Bach fell under Michael's spell. Michael is a very seductive talker. He will, he makes the magic over a candlelit table. He can make a film in your head that you absolutely must see. You'll pay whatever it takes. Oh, I have the money to do that. Let's do that. So you get involved on that level. And really what happened is kind of like Bach fell out of love with Cimino because of the difficulties. It's like you wake up after the honeymoon and you're actually in this process of making this picture together.
Yeah.
And Cimino is not misbehaving, because he's being, the thing that Bach keeps acknowledging, gosh, this was the most organized editing room I'd ever been in. It's not like chaos everywhere. Every piece of footage, you could find it to the frame. Everything is documented. It's like the Alexandria Library in there. You know exactly how to find everything. And Cimino's super organized, and because that's the key to the guy. He's never disorganized. And so, but nevertheless, I think, he has a natural dislike of people breathing down his neck. And so, I don't think Bach knew how to handle him. And Bach, as much as confesses this, so, I think it's, in a weird way, a kind of honorable performance, but at the same time, it does nothing but harm to Cimino, because it's like it doesn't have the perspective of really seeing that this is a passionate disappointment that's being expressed here.
Yeah. Bach wanted to make the movie. He had been aware of the script and knew what he was getting into.
Yeah,
so that's
it's
why
like a Western
so
directed by
bizarre.
David Lean, And he didn't, I think that there was a level on which, when you read I've read the book a couple of times, and I know that like a lot of the battles, Bach chose his battles badly with Cimino on a level, because he kept fighting him on casting.
Yeah.
And it's like, don't fight him on casting. Fight him on story. Help him tell the story well. Like trying to cast Jane Fonda in the role that was played by Isabelle Huppert. No, not gonna happen. You just don't let Cimino choose his actors, because he's so great with actors. He has such great actor sense. But the thing to help him with is help him get his story told. Make sure that. Look at the script closely and just ask him is there enough going on between, the character that John Hurt plays, and do we have enough scenes with him, because the thread of his story gets lost under in the mine shaft,
Yeah.
Now, maybe that footage exists and Cimino was choosing it, I feel that when I look at the thing from as objectively as I can, I think that they were wrong to shoot for a release date in November of 1980. Given the amount of footage they had to go through, I would have urged Bach.
Do you think that was because of the stresses of the company, and they thought we need to get a new movie out there?
Well, to a degree, I think what happens is that you make a deal to get the movie out by such and such a date, and I think that date was was the wrong gesture. It's like, okay, we've got a guy on our hands who's going to make a big movie. Why don't we push the date back so that we're on board? Because there was the whole issue of Final Cut in that book is, Cimino can maintain Final Cut if he delivers the film by such and such a date, and it's sort of like, and what did it say? It was also a clause that Cimino will not be held responsible for over budget to reach this date of November 1980.
Yeah.
Now, okay, that was Michael basically being a tough negotiator, saying, all right, you want me to hit that date? Then you can't hold me responsible for the amount of budget that it's going to take to get you to that date. Now, that's just being honest. When you come, he knows what it's going to take to hit that date.
Yeah.
But what I feel Stephen Bach failed to do was to recognize, okay, this is nitroglycerin we're dealing with here. Why not push the date back to the opening at Cannes, the Cannes Film Festival of May 1981? If that's your opening, then you've got 4 months more to process that footage. Just for Cimino to tell the story well, to tell the story in its optimal form. Because I think the other thing that emerges is when everything collapsed on the opening night, Cimino immediately offered to do a recut. That's because he himself, I think, was unsettled about what he turned in. He absolutely believes in the film, but he knows that he knows that he could fine tune the symphony a number of ways to make it better.
The version that's out now on Criterion, that's a newer cut in a way?
No, Cimino thought of making some cuts in that, and he decided against. The only cut that he made, he actually tweaks the last scene just a little bit. He reordered the frames, and that's a controversy for lovers of the original film, but it's interesting. But otherwise, he left it untouched, except he removed the intermission, and that's the test of true love, because you people just need a pee break. But in the theater, I noticed that, because it almost seemed like people were walking out on the film. They weren't. They were running out, and then they were running back in. So there was that test. But otherwise, the film on Criterion is its optimal version, in the sense that he also color corrected it. He took the sepia tone out of it, he sort of revised that decision, and it just pops off the screen beautifully now. But I think what happened is that, really, Final Cut as a book is a tragic tale, because you see that you've got a set of irreconcilable differences are set up at the beginning. And it's not Cimino's fault, and it's not Stephen Bach's fault. It is Stephen Bach's responsibility, in a sense, to be the executive who can see far enough ahead that he's got to. If you love this director, if you love the guy who did Deer Hunter, you got to figure out how to protect his ass at the other end, and say to yourself realistically, what can we bring this in for? That way you're also signing a responsible contract. You're not allowing him to go over budget. You're saying, no, why don't we release it in May of 1981 and leave that other codicil out of the thing, and just work out a responsible budget together, day by day. Because Cimino's a pro, he can work to that, but he was basically knowing that the limits that they were setting for him, he was going to use that to the advantage of the film.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful film. I saw it recently.
Yeah,
looks amazing on the Criterion restoration.
Yes, and he was doing something very unusual with character, which is that he's inviting you to identify with whoever you want to identify with in the film. He's not, as a protagonist, the Chris Christopherson character is very recessive. He's very much a man in shadow. He's very much the narrator of the film rather than the protagonist. And that is so fascinating as an approach, that you have to. It really was a bold and challenging film, and I know that that there was probably, from Cimino's own heart and soul, there's probably a more optimal version was within reach had there been just a bit more time to flesh it out and connect with more people, because Cimino's ability to connect with an audience is a very mysterious piece of alchemy. He really connects with people by showing people in action, without narration, and without manipulating through cuts and cameras. And let me be specific about what I mean. The Deer Hunter has no cross dissolves in it. There's no dissolves. There's no, like, for example, you go straight from the solitary Chopin piece with the guys in the bar listening quietly to bang, helicopter. And it's a beautiful
I've always
shot.
wondered about that decision to not have it. It's such like a standard, conventional, you would say, dissolve to Vietnam.
Exactly.
I wonder why he didn't.
And there are no dissolves in Heaven's Gate either. He will instead cut to clouds moving across the plain. You will suddenly cut to.
That'll be his bridge to get to the next.
Yeah, exactly. You'll suddenly be. You cut to smoke, and suddenly you discover what you're looking at. And in Deer Hunter, there's an amazingly beautiful shot of Robert De Niro in his beret, fully dressed in semi-dark, and then you realize, no, he looks out. You're behind a sign. You think you've come from the hotel to him in the semi-dark, and you realize, no, he's hiding behind a billboard, looking at the funeral party in broad daylight below. It's just you thought you were in the darkness, and you're actually back in daylight, and it's like no dissolves, and it's like a beautifully judged decision to cut. And Cimino's whole aesthetic is so alive in that particular way that it's just, as with Welles, it's just tragic that it doesn't get understood in time or protected.
Or I wish there was more of a filmography in a sense. I wish
Yeah.
we had seen more films from Michael.
Yes.
There are, great ones out there, but
Yeah, it's I mean the later films are like The Sicilian. I saw that not long ago. That's still a great film. I worried, okay, did I overrate it, because I really liked it when I first saw it, and I thought, well, people argue with Christopher Lambert in the lead, and I can understand that because his voice is sort of high pitched and it doesn't promote the authority that you need to be that that leader of men, and I think, okay, because everybody else in the movie has a marvelous voice, and I know from knowing Cimino, I know that he really worked hard with Lambert to lower his voice by a couple of octaves, but there are levels an actor can't give you, so. But watching the film again a couple of years ago, just watched it through one night, and no, it's beautiful. It's to the extent that Giuliano, that Lambert is off as Giuliano, and it's like, no, the part has come to fit him now, because it's like the uncertainty actually informs the character and the story that's being told. So I think that it's a tragedy in Cimino's case. I think partly because, unlike Welles, he could not go on working on his own. I mean, he does go working on his own as a writer, but landing the deal that gets the next one made. Because there are some magnificent pictures that he wanted to make and couldn't. The
Fountainhead was one that
talks
about a lot with Clint Eastwood.
Yeah, that was actually, and that was a fairly early on, and it's interesting about that because he thought this is. I remember, when I first met him, I met him in late August of 1985, and Final Cut had just come out. So we're just getting to know each other. I said, "So, have you read that book, Final Cut?" He said, "No, I haven't read it." And just, okay, done, dismissed, done. Don't go there. And later on, as I got to know him better, I said, "So, I mean, Final Cut, that book disturbed you?" He said, "I haven't read it." And I thought, okay, are you telling me the truth, or because I thought maybe he's just protecting himself, because why not, trust that to a friend and don't pester him much, and so at one point, after we were walking out having dinner, we're just walking the street. I said, well, it's like you wanted to do the Fountainhead, da 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 da, and he said, how the fuck did you know I wanted to do the Fountainhead? I said, well, I guess I read it in Final Cut. And I mean, he practically floated off the sidewalk as he turned to me. I mean, it was like, and I mean, the look of astonishment on his face. He said, the Fountainhead that's in Final Cut? I thought Final Cut's a book about Heaven's Gate. I said, well, he deals with the fact that you were a wrestler at Madison, Wisconsin, and you edited the yearbook, and then you did, and it's like it was like I was.
You can believe all this personal information.
It's like I was throwing buckets of cold water on him. He's like, and he's like laughing while I'm doing it because he's like, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? That's in there too." I said, "Geez, I might actually have to. You mean I'm going to actually have to read that book now? Because you're telling me that's in there." So that was funny. That brought it to. He really didn't want to look at.
Yeah. Is there any reason why he's been so sort of secretive or under the radar over the years? Like I remember for years he didn't want to be interviewed, didn't want to be photographed.
Yeah, I think that he's, it's a mystery of a certain creative personality. From the first moment I met him, I realized I was in the presence of a guy, because I'd read a lot about J.D. Salinger, and I knew that, it's like a friend of Salinger's named Peter DeVries said, yeah, if you're a friend of Jerry's, it's like you're in the mob. You don't talk about it, And I realized, I mean, I'm getting stuff from Cimino that I can't talk about with my fellow film critics. It's just because he's given me the gold, but it's like he's trusting me not to go blabbing, and it's even little bits of gold about how things are produced, And because with Cimino, you don't. I realized too from meeting him and talking with him, Jerry Harvey. Michael won't talk about big meaning in his movies. What were your intentions so much, or how did you the philosophy and all this sort of stuff. It's all about, if you ask him, that shot in Heaven's Gate. Like when you're up doing the railroad, and he said, oh yeah, well, and he'll give you an anecdote about how they got that particular freight car, and what we went through to get that, and he'll tell you a story, because he's a storyteller. He's not an abstract philosopher, And
the few interviews that he has out there, I mean, he's an incredible storyteller. He's so detailed. He's so charismatic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And he's also he'll say, what did he say at one point to me? He said, Heaven's Gate. No, people don't seem to realize that it all builds to that moment on the boat. They said, what's he doing on the boat in 1905? I mean, the whole movie is a backward glance taken in regret, and you don't know that till the last moment, And I thought, what a great definition of your own film. But that's exactly what he was shooting for, and he made the movie he set out to make. And so he is, I mean, he's when the few times you can get him to look at Heaven's Gate, he comes back beaming with pride. He made exactly the movie he had in his head, So there's, and I mean, when the first interview he gave about Heaven's Gate was like many years after, it was like 1990, I think, and he gave it. It was when Desperate Hours was coming out. He agreed to do an interview with Gene Shalit, I guess, on the Today Show, and so Gene Shalit said, I have to ask you about Heaven's Gate. And he said, well, I'm happy to answer you. He said, he said, well, what about it? He said, well, people criticize it. He said, but, my answer is what he said, what Kennedy said about the Bay of Pigs. I take full responsibility. I take full responsibility for Heaven's Gate. And I don't hesitate. I'm proud of that movie. Yeah. And boom, done. It's like end of discussion. Robert Frost wrote a poem called The Drumlin Woodchuck, which is about, the woodchuck who's got an entrance at both ends of its burrow, and how it's protective fundamentally of the privacy of its life, because that privacy is the thing out of which the great creation comes. And so really, if, I'm tunneling through a lot of vapors about Cimino, but really the reason we don't know more about him is because he has needed the privacy that he's cultivated around himself to create the things he needs to create.
Do you think we'll ever see another film from him?
I hope we do. He has the capacity to do it. I think it's up to so many things. It's a matter of getting financing in a row. I mean, he has, on the one hand, I know there's a small film that he's written called Cream Rises, which he could make for a very low budget, and that's been publicized that he's going to do that. He worked for a number of years on an adaptation of Man's Fate by Andre Malraux, which I read, and is such an amazing script that he's written for it. That I can assure you it's a really wonderful script, and would be a dynamite project, because it would be a movie to set beside Deer Hunter and Heaven's Gate as, majesty and epic. He wrote a film called Conquering Horse, which is set among the Lakota Sioux, and he wanted to do that right after Heaven's Gate in the early 80s. It's like with Welles, you see these things that they wanted to do and didn't get done in time. It's like, And to bring it back to Welles, the Other Side of the Wind has been unfortunately superseded by, say, Natural Born Killers. What Welles was trying to do in 1970, 25 years later, Well,
allegedly, they say Oliver Stone had actually seen some cut of The Other Side of the Wind, and that kind of inspired him. I read that somewhere. I don't know if that's true. But
Well, it depends on when he saw it. I mean, because I understood that he'd seen it. They showed him footage after Natural Born Killers, and he complimented Oya Kodar, but I have to re-reference Karp's book, but it would make sense if he did. I think that, though, to give Oliver Stone his due credit, I think what Welles was filming was the thing that was already there, kind of in the culture, that you could see in the jazzier commercials. That because Welles loved commercials. He felt that they were, sometimes you were seeing, dazzling stuff, because in the space of a minute, a lot gets communicated. And so that gave Welles confidence. And there was also some wonderful montage things that would show for play on TV, where classical gas with every work of art, and like 3,000 years of art in 3 minutes, And so there was a whole sense of speeded up psychedelia that Welles knew would translate well, into filmmaking techniques. So he was right on top of what was going to become the next wave. And basically, I think, out of his own particular orientation, Oliver Stone was able to catch the crest of that wave in 1993. What I hope people take away from my book is just how engaged with the world Orson Welles was. how completely engaged he was with the world from beginning to end. Right up to his dying day, he was engaged with the world as an independent reality, and his vision was to try and be true to his imagination while reacting to the world. So his political activities are very profound and very real. You get a strong sense of that in my book, and then the rest of it is simply that he was ambitiously productive. He never gave up. He died at his typewriter.
Yeah.
This is, people talk about his failure after Citizen Kane. This is not a life of failure. A life of eclipse from time to time, but not failure.